Hello, everyone. So thanks for coming to the talk. I'll be presenting on behalf of Zhang today, who unfortunately couldn't make it. So we did some work in designing for Chinese learners of English. And when you look at people who have learned English for many years, coming through the Chinese education system, many of them are coming to the United States and then still having trouble communicating in some very basic scenarios like informal context. And when you look at the education system in China, it's pretty clear why this is. There's a big focus on textbooks. The students are going to spend a lot of time memorizing lists of vocabulary and grammar structures, and ultimately be judged based on their ability to complete standardized tests. In contrast, when you look at the way that we actually need to interact when, say, you're studying abroad in the United States, for example, you're going to need to dynamically react to the situations that are going on. You're going to need to think about how to express whatever ideas you may be having and creatively overcome possible deficiencies in your language skills. So kind of given this gap between what's being taught in the Chinese classrooms now and the skills that, some of the skills that are very important to these learners, we wanted to look at how we could design to kind of fill in part of that gap. And we looked for inspiration from role-playing games, which have fortunately been discussed quite a bit in the last couple presentations, but just a quick summary again for those who came late. You have some kind of dungeon master or moderator who's kind of creating the challenges for the players, and then the players are talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do next, and then ultimately discuss it, saying what it is that they need to do, and role-playing the story together. There's kind of a high barrier to entry to Dungeons & Dragons, however, and it's not going to be appropriate for every student, for example, because you have to spend a lot of time reading these rule books, learning how to play, and you have to kind of be acclimated with the lore that's involved with Dungeons & Dragons. So given that challenge, there's another type of game that we looked at, which is more open-ended collaborative narrative games. So for example, Once Upon a Time, in this game, players have cards with fairy tale elements on them, and then they kind of take turns collaboratively telling a fairy tale together. So using inspiration from these games, we created our own storytelling game to help students practice creative expression of English. And we'll talk about that design process and some of the challenges we identified, and then some design recommendations. So first, a little bit about our design process. We designed a total of 7 different prototypes. So some of them were more like Dungeons & Dragons, some more like Once Upon a Time. There were a total of 41 students that participated in the studies that we did, and these were all kind of intermediate English learners, so 14 to 21. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the advantages and challenges of the 2 different types of games that I talked about, and then ultimately how we brought ideas from both of these types of games in our final design. So first, open narrative prototype. So this is like Once Upon a Time, where players are just coming together to tell a story together. There's not a lot of structure. So these are useful in a classroom setting because they're very easy for teachers to make. So it's easy to just pick out some vocabulary or concepts from the class that you want students to practice, and then you can put those on cards and ask students to build stories out of that. However, many students find it difficult to create stories in this very open context, and students often ignore each other when you don't have more constraints on the gameplay. So I want to illustrate both of these challenges. So first, it's pretty clear that it might be difficult for a student who's not a native speaker of English to look at one of these cards and create a story based on that. So if I asked you to take the card, say, decorated with, and tell me part of a story based on that, that would be pretty difficult for many of you even, and even more so for somebody who's just learning English. And the other main issue that we identified from trying prototypes that use this open narrative structure is that there's a lot of breaks in continuity. The students aren't really listening to each other. So here you can see one student is talking about Anna's legs are cured, and then there's a masked man, and then the second student completely ignores the first student and starts talking about like fighting a monster. And we think that this, from our interviews with the students, it seems like students were so focused on figuring out what they were going to say that they weren't really paying attention to the other students and not benefiting from peer learning that could have been happening. So given these challenges, we also wanted to look at role-playing games, something more like Dungeons & Dragons that has a lot of structure. And what we found is that these types of games are generally more structured and engaging for students. The students are discussing like what it is they want to do next, and the students generally liked role-playing characters. But what we found is that there are some issues with this approach as well. So the complex mechanics are difficult to learn for students and difficult to set up in a classroom setting. And the game details are difficult to adapt. So as I mentioned, the mechanics are very difficult in role-playing games for students to learn and play all in like a single hour-long classroom session. So for example, we designed one game set in 1930s Shanghai. It took many hours of effort from the teacher to set up this scenario and create the challenges for the students to go through, create the characters that were going to be involved in this story. And then it took almost 30 minutes of the class time to teach the students about this scenario, teach them the rules. And so this really isn't a good long-term approach for getting students playing these games. And also, not only does it take a lot of effort to build these scenarios the first time, but these scenarios are difficult to adapt. So once the students go through a scenario once, it's not going to be as interesting the second time. And if you move into a new section in the curriculum, the previous scenario may not necessarily fit with the goals that were that are in that new curriculum content. So, kind of given these challenges of the different types of games that we looked at, we refined our design question a little bit, and we wanted to figure out a way to keep students engaged with more concrete narrative elements, and then while at the same time maintaining adaptability and ease of use, so that students could jump into the game quickly, so that teachers could quickly adapt the content. And kind of the key concept that we identified here for keeping students engaged, keeping students listening to each other, is this idea of narrative grounding. And this is based on the idea of grounding in the communication sense, but rather than just understanding each other, it's also understanding the context of the story, understanding what the moderator is saying. And I just want to show you the quick video of how the game works. Hopefully we have sound.
One Story is a collaborative storytelling game. Players will be given a background, and they will continue to create the rest of the story. Players are divided into two different teams with competing goals. However, both teams contribute to the same collective story. One team is the Guardians, the other are the Tricksters. When the Guardians tell their part of the story, they will try and help the protagonists make progress and eventually complete their journey. The Tricksters, on the other hand, will try and create difficulties for the protagonist. There are two types of cards: content cards and language cards. Content cards include story elements like characters and objects. Language cards include words or language patterns chosen by an instructor that the players will need to use when telling their part of the story.
Okay. So just a quick summary of the video that we just watched. So we designed these concrete narrative elements, these objects, these characters for players to use as they're telling this story. These are shared in the common area, so all of the students can see these characters and objects and use these as they're telling their part of the story. And as I mentioned, there's also content cards, and these are there so that students are practicing the specific concepts of any specific part of the curriculum. These are easy for teachers to make. You can just create words with vocabulary or ideas on them. And finally, we have these students divided into two competing teams to create challenges for each other rather than having the instructor create all of the challenges him or herself. So I just want to show you one more video to illustrate how the game is how gameplay actually looks.
In this playthrough, the story is set in space, and the game will begin on an alien planet.
Everyone worships him. So Tai took advantage of this, overthrew Edward's rule and put him in prison. One day, Edward escaped from the jail, and he met Anna, and he begged Anna to help him.
I will first use this character Jack, the musician, called the musician, and this card, the bionic eyes. So I will first choose some card to carry out this conversation. I want to use this onyx rod. And another create foundation. So Anna has met a strange musician, Jack. He is very cold and he owns bionic eyes. So what's the functionality of this bionic eyes? Finally, Anna and Jack has defeated the evil magician Tai, and they saved the king and his people.
Okay, so with this final prototype of the game, we wanted to do a more formal study. I won't have a lot of time to talk about all the details of that, but if you're interested, details are all in the paper. So we had 3 to 6 students per group and 30-minute play sessions, and then we collected data through interviews, surveys, and writing samples. The writing samples were evaluated using Mechanical Turk. We asked for we asked the Turkers to evaluate like how imaginative or cohesive the story was. And I just want to conclude with some of our design recommendations based on what we found in this final lab study. So first of all, game mechanics can be used to encourage active listening. So when we talk to students, like for example, this last student mentioned, they think it's very helpful for beginners to play a game like this because they're not just using their own language knowledge to create the story, but they're listening to their peers. They're able to pick up words from them and see how they're using the language. Second is concrete characters and settings help to inspire new ideas and build common ground. So by having these common characters that all of the different players share, you keep the stories much more cohesive. So the story becomes about the specific characters that are shared in play. And this one student who played an earlier version of the game that was much more open-ended mentioned that it's much more useful to have some constraints on the storytelling so that you can think of ideas. And then finally, both students and teachers can help contribute to scaffolding learning. So as I mentioned, when we tried to develop something like Dungeons and Dragons, it became a lot of work for the teachers to construct these scenarios and build all of the new challenges for students to engage in. But you can actually use students to build these challenges as well. When you create this adversarial structure in the game, then the students need to listen to each other. They need to set up challenges for each other, and then the other students need to resolve those challenges and then open new challenges for the other team. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
Does that mean we do have time? Okay. Thanks for your talk. was wondering, rather than direct people towards specific goals on cards and so forth alone, why not have them repeat something like a summary of the last respondent's turn? Because there you get some exercise with comprehension as well as an ability to use some of the same vocabulary.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I could imagine that would slow down the flow of the game.
Yeah.
So if every time somebody says something and then you hear that same thing being said again, it could be helpful for language learning, but you might disengage some of the players that way. So yeah, that's definitely something that's worth trying. Thank you.
Hi, Leonard Malte, University of Waterloo. You said at the end you want to support collaborative learning through technology. How is the use of technology already present at this stage when you did your initial evaluations? Were you considering form factors of any technology? Were you thinking about maybe going mobile or web, or was any of that a concern as you were running the initial study?
Yeah, so part of what we found very early on was that that face-to-face interaction was really important to keeping students engaged. So I think if we were to develop a technology, it would be something more like the first presentation, where we have something physical where students can still see each other and like watch each other perform the language rather than just see it as text or an audio recording.
Okay, but you haven't tried anything with Arduino or 3D printing or anything?
No, we haven't yet.
Okay, cool.